Hello, everyone, and welcome to Thursdays on the Soup. Today we have Poem Plus Prompt with Dilruba Ahmed. And just a little bit about her before I pass it over. Dilruba Ahmed is the author of Bring Now the Angels, with poems featured in New York Times Magazine, The Slowdown, and Poetry Unbound. Her debut book of poetry, Dhaka Dust, won the Bakeless Prize. Her poems have appeared in Kenyon Review, New England Review, Plowshares, and Virginia Quarterly Review. Her poems have also been anthologized in the Best American Poetry 2019, Halal If You Hear Me, Literature, The Human Experience, and elsewhere. Ahmed is the recipient of the Florida Review's Editor Award, a Dorothy Sargent Rosenberg Memorial Prize, and the Catherine Bakeless Nason Fellowship in Poetry awarded by the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. She holds degrees from the University of Pittsburgh and Warren Wilson College's MFA program for writers. I'm also going to drop below her link for classes and consultations. She's amazing. If you're interested in learning more from her, her website will be down below. But without further ado, I'm passing it over to Dilruba.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I am so excited to be here teaching for Thursdays on the Stoop. I see a lot of familiar names and faces. So welcome back to those of you I've worked with before, and welcome to all of you who are new to being in the classroom with me. I have been thinking a lot about, for many years now, about autobiographical material and different ways to get at it, different ways to represent it, different ways to kind of convey things that are emotional truths without necessarily conveying, sort of the whole truth. I think one of the struggles that we often have, or at least I have had, is wanting to tell a tale of some kind that's based in real lived experience, but then trying to figure out for the reader on the end, what's really compelling, what's interesting, what's going to be textured and interesting, and a journey of discovery for my reader. So today's session is a brief exploration of the self-portrait as one way into autobiographical material, but thinking about the idea of reflection and refraction, which is to say, are there things, either concrete items or abstractions out in the world, that we can sort of put up against our own reflections to see ourselves in a different way and to understand ourselves in a new light? I picked 3 poems today. Usually for Poem Plus Prompt, we only talk about one, but I did want you to have a little bit of a variety, a range, even though it's a short class, but we'll kind of spend more time with one in particular. But what you'll see in these self-portraits is that they're framed as self-portraits at a certain age, or with something, or as something. So I'm really curious about that idea of either, taking a kind of snapshot in time and trying to convey something that's particular to that phase of life, or taking something from outside in the world, either, as I mentioned, either an object or an idea or some kind of abstraction, and kind of rubbing up against it and seeing, okay, how can I refract my experience through this thing? How can I reflect the self through this thing? And I wanted to just briefly share there's a video interview, a video of an interview with Rick Barrett. He's interviewed by Jane Wong. I encourage you to look it up and to watch it. And at one point, someone in the audience asks Rick Barrett about his most recent book, The Galleons. They wanted to know about his research process. How does he go about conducting research for a book like The Galleons, which tackles many, many layers of personal history and the history of the Philippines, which is his home country. And he says something very interesting in response, which is that he recognizes that in some fields, in the social sciences and beyond, there is a very specific protocol that people follow when they're doing research. And then he goes on to say, I'm a poet. And he likens his research process to walking into Goodwill and sort of wandering around and seeing what objects call out to him and picking them up and sort of examining them and investigating them. And so that's a little bit of what we're going to try to do today with the self-portrait. We're going to kind of think about, in our environment, in our imagination, what are the things that we're kind of called to, that we can kind of pick up and look at and see ourselves through or against or with, in order to convey the self in sort of new and fresh and maybe surprising ways. So we are going to wander. We'll start with, I have a PDF with the poems that I'm going to drop in the chat. And we're going to start with a warm-up exercise. I'll share this on the screen too, but that's coming through the chat. Oops, here we go. Okay. Okay, does everybody see a screen that says poem plus prompt?
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. The warm-up is taken from an exercise by Maggie Queenie, and it's called the personality test. And this is just meant to be a quick warm-up, just to get our ideas kind of flowing, and to get some draft ideas out on paper before we investigate a couple of the poems that are in the packet, and do some writing, specific to a self-portrait form. So just to kind of get started and do a little bit of warm-up, thinking and writing, here are some questions I'm asking you to respond to. Let me see if I can make this bigger. Let's use this version. Okay. So 10 questions. Who are you? And you can answer that as you feel, as you see fit, as you feel compelled to answer. Number 2, if you could be any animal, what animal would you be? 3, if you could be any color, what color would you be? 4, if you could be any sound, what sound would you be? Number 5, what texture are you? Number 6, what movement is most like you? Number 7, if you could be any space, such as a cupboard, a canyon, a church, what space would you be? 8, what object are you? Again, answer as you feel moved to answer. Number 9, what do you want to be? And number 10, what are you not? So take about, let's say, 4 or 5 minutes to just quickly generate some responses to these 10 questions.
in my meeting.
Okay, take another minute or so to wrap up your responses to these prompts. And if you've already finished, try going back to any one of them and just elaborating a little bit in the time remaining. Okay, go ahead and wrap up whatever thought you're on. And I won't be asking you to share these out loud, but we're just going to kind of put them on the back burner and let them simmer. And then we'll return to them when we begin the writing prompts closer to the end of our time together. What I'd like to share now is some guiding questions that are meant to help us unpack the poems for today's discussion. Those of you who have been in classes with me before know that I always aim to get all of you talking. I'm interested in hearing your responses to the poems and your questions about the poems. So to get us started, some of the guiding questions are, are here. How does the poet paint a self-portrait? How does the poet flesh out the physical, emotional, and intellectual context of the poem? And that's language that's directly from an essay by Stephen Dobbins in a book called Best Words, Best Order. And it's a chapter on metaphor. And so what Dobbins says in that chapter is that in order for a reader to fully grasp and experience a metaphor in a way that has power, the poet has to establish these three contexts. The physical context, sort of like, where are we in the poem? Who's there? What's the sort of physical landscape? The emotional context, which has everything to do with tone, right? What's at stake? What are the emotions at hand? And the intellectual context, which, you know, you may have heard in some workshops, the idea that every poem is making an argument of some kind. And so the idea is, you know, it might be an argument that's really in the foreground with a lot of rhetorical flourishes, or it might be something really dialed back that you have to, you know, kind of dig to figure out. So we'll be looking at these poems to see how does the poet go about fleshing out these three different contexts in the poem. Number two, what is revealed about the self and what is withheld? And along those lines, what are the poem's sources of tension? What seems to be at stake for the reader, or for the speaker? What matters to them? What are they grappling with? Three, how would you describe the tone? Which is, you know, we can kind of use that interchangeably with the emotional context. And then all the while, I'll be asking you to kind of point us to specific moments in the text so that we can look at significant craft strategies at play, whether it's related to the responses to questions 1 through 3, or other things that seem to be at play that are contributing to what we learn about the speaker and or what's withheld. So we'll keep those questions on the table, and let's hear this first one out loud. Self-Portrait at 10 by Roxanne Beth Johnson. Is there a volunteer who'd be willing to read this one out loud? Maureen,
I'll do it.
Oh, Connor, we'll get you next time. Thank you.
You're fine. Yeah.
Okay, am I unmuted?
Yes.
All right. Self-portrait at 10. A boarded up house, ransacked inside, broken glass and toppled tables, chairs overturned, books shaken for hidden money. There are mouths in dreams full of gold teeth, chewing bread and meat. The body is hollow as flame and will burn down anything if pointed straight. A bird flies in through the door, then flutters at the window. Although he is tiny, I am too afraid to help him escape. I've made myself another house. I hum to fill its empty rooms. I fold in like saloon doors, closing, then swinging out, keeping out thieves.
Thank you, Maureen. I was just thinking about the phrases, the terms I use to think about, what kind of self-portraits we could create. And I use the words reflect, refract, but I also want to put the word framing out there so that we can think about how we might frame certain aspects of the self as we see in this one. So let's start with your general responses to the poem, starting with number one. How does the poet paint a self-portrait in this poem? And you can either use your raise hand emoji, or you can give me a little wave. We might be able to, if you just kind of unmute and jump in, that might work too, depending on how many people are trying to say something.
It just seems to have a very much a worn down, abandoned feel to it.
Yeah, worn down and abandoned. Robert, I think it was Robert. Robert, can you point us to some moments where you see that happening and help us understand, how does the poet get that feeling across, or that kind of context across?
It's certainly in the first sentence, and that boarded up house just immediately gives you an image. The idea of ransacked inside, I mean, clearly nobody has lived there, so it's been abandoned. And just talking about overturned chairs and broken glass in particular is where, I mean, that sort of resonated for me.
Yeah, both narrative details and a little bit of sensory detail about, or sort of evoking a sense, right? Broken glass evokes something sharp and pointy. And so we get this idea of something that's been through chaos. There's chaos and it's been tumultuous, but is now abandoned. Mona, and then Alyssa.
Yeah, I see the way the speaker is moving from the house itself, the physical, to the house inside herself before she even builds it in the last couple of lines there. She's moving into the mouths and dreams. So when she's in that house, she's immediately starting to move into her own little tiny house inside, just because of everything she's surrounded by.
Yeah, that you mean the house at the end that she moves into, that she makes, is that right?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that really comes to stand in contrast to the boarded up house from the beginning, right? So there's the boarded up house, which is sort of, this frame. She's at 10 years old. This is how she's framing the self. And, we don't have a sense of how much time may have passed, but the sentence reads, I've made myself another house. And all those verbs come in, right? I've made, I hum, I fold. Suddenly there's a lot of activity and movement by the speaker. And that helps to convey a sense of agency, right? It's not someone who's just sort of left behind, but is instead fashioning something new and moving freely within it. Alyssa. And then
I noticed something very similar to Mona, which is that at the very beginning, we start with a boarded up house, which is kind of something on the exterior emotionally. And then we dive in further into her emotional interiority. And then at the very end, she's back at a house, but she's building it. And it seems like it's offering her more protection, but it's still kind of like this closed off emotionality, because she's folding in like saloon doors, keeping out thieves, keeping out others emotionally.
Yeah, it's not entirely a positive context, right? But it's one of agency and one of refashioning, or, we might even say healing. But at the same time, it's not without, some traces of what we already know about the interior state. And I think, those are really keen observations about what we come to learn about that new house. I fold in like saloon doors closing, right? It's a new house, but it has its kind of limitations. And then swinging out, keeping out thieves. So there's a real sense of self-protection in those lines. Alina.
So I just wanted to make a quick comment that I found the title and the first line in such fascinating juxtaposition that the poem immediately grabbed me, because it's self-portrait at 10. And to assert that that is you at 10, a boarded up house, is so provocative and frightening. So I thought that was just such a smart move by the poet.
Yeah, incredible opening, right? When we think about age 10, we're thinking, you know, childhood, maybe something sort of carefree and fun. But the poem starts off with something that really defies any expectations about that. And so that gap between what our expectations might be from the title versus what we encounter in that first line really creates this disjunction that compels us to keep reading to find out, why is this so? Why is the speaker framing the self as a boarded up house at the age of 10? And that's reminds me of something else that Stephen Dobbins writes about in the book Best Words, Best Order. In his chapter on structure, he talks about creating, how the role of the poet is to create the desire to know. And I think, you know, that's a great example of the poet creating the desire to know so that we feel compelled to keep reading. Mona, did you want to add to, I see your comment in the chat.
Yeah, I'm just saying that I know what my life was like at 10. So I believe this didn't take place over many years in which she built that other little house. I believe it happened almost instantly. Just she's in a real house and all of this came upon her, and yeah, she protected herself.
Yeah, it sounds like a response to the implication of trauma around this house being turned upside down, right? So it's that opening is a really incredible example of how sensory and narrative details can both show and tell. They can sort of establish the physical context. Where are we? What's going on? We don't have all the answers, but we start to get a glimpse. And at the same time, start to reveal or resonate with the emotional context, right? One of upheaval, confusion, possibly violence, and despair. So it does sound like it's, you know, it's a self-protection mechanism that arises immediately out of that chaos. Other thoughts? Let's actually see what the other questions are here. So what have we not covered yet? So in terms of what's been revealed about the self and what's been withheld, we've talked, you know, a fair amount about what's been revealed. What are some of the things that have been withheld, or are there other comments on what you see as the poem's sources of tension, or what you would describe as the tone? Maureen, go ahead.
Well, we don't know exactly what the trauma was or the discord in this young life. And I don't know if we need to know, but that might give us more information. And so the tension is, I think, feeling what a life at 10 should be like and focused on versus what obviously is being revealed here that's being focused on instead, and not knowing what brought the speaker to this place.
Yeah, so Alina, go ahead. Do you want to add to that?
Well, I think that that's a really good point. I was just going to add that the other thing that's missing is any kind of adult opinion. So from the point of view of the poet now, there's nothing, right? So she's sort of recreating the child's world.
Yeah, the frame is putting us in that age 10 without any voiceover, right? We don't get the retrospective view. Instead, we get the scene and then just that quick turn into the self-protection mode. But the frame is very sort of tight, we don't get anything outside of that. So that's one way of approaching a self-portrait poem. Robert, go ahead. And then Mona.
So just to get back to your question about the tension, I mean, for me, this idea of the boarded house, and then in the last two lines, or I guess mini stanzas, where you want to call them, the bird flies in through the door and flutters the window. Although he's tiny, I'm too afraid to help him escape. There's definitely a fear there and because of that fear, the speaker is alone as they've made this house and filled it with empty rooms. There just seems to be a sense of anxiety that has stayed with them throughout this experience. So I mean, I kind of read it as, if it is sort of this older person that fear has stayed with them, and they're still trying to cope with it as they have built their own home.
Yeah, there's a kind of hint or implication of adult presence, but there are no actual adults in the scene. And the only other sort of living thing is that bird that the speaker sees, but is too afraid to help. So, the absence of any kind of adult presence in the poem, given what we know about the context, becomes very ominous. And that's, it's an incredible way of creating, of revealing something, eliciting a response from us, which is, we have to make that deduction. We come to our own inferences about what it is we know or can glean from what's provided. But the poem withholds a fair amount, right? There's a lot of restraint here, a lot of mystery to what's actually happening.
It's funny because I just assumed that she had built the poet had built another house. It still could have been, still, to your point, still be a child, and just they've made themselves another house.
Yeah. I mean, you're right. We don't have a lot of context about the passage of time. It could be in the moment of experiencing this kind of upheaval that there's a kind of self-protection mode that clicks in. There is certainly, a possibility that that's sort of the speaker's way of moving through the world now, right? With this sort of protective mode and almost dissociated from what it is that's happening or has happened. Mona, and then I think it's Claudia. Go ahead.
I agree with what you and Robert are both saying, kind of that there is enough revealed and enough withheld to get us into the picture and to get us into the picture in the speaker's head, but also put ourselves into the picture. However, the bird flying in through the door may not be a bird. It may be a possibility. And it is a tiny possibility that the speaker is too afraid to help and too afraid to reach for.
Yeah, absolutely. It could be a literal bird, but it could also take on a kind of symbolic value in this context, right? A flutter of hope or possibility, or, something glimmering, but there's too much fear. There's too much of a gap between the speaker's experience and that possibility for something different. Claudia, let me know if I got your name right.
I usually go by Nyla, but Claudia.
Nyla, I'm sorry. Okay, I had it backwards. Go ahead.
It doesn't matter. Yeah, I don't see it as a sudden shift. I see it as I see this whole thing as a process. It's a very sweet kind of a process. She's there, and she's merging into the beginnings of her adulthood, and and it's going to involve closing her off in some ways and defending against the thieves, but also, that whole shutting off process, allowing her to be like compassionate, to the bird. This is her way of being strong enough so that she can reach out to others, like the bird. And I also was struck by the word hum, because she's humming, she's, art is going to be part of this process, and it's all part of, how she's starting to grow up and what her mechanisms are to be as strong and the best person she can.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's just that one last stanza or paragraph, if we want to call it that, that makes that shift. And while we don't have, all the answers about the passage of time, what we do see is a kind of transformation, one where she has agency. But what I think is interesting in terms of thinking about closure is that it's not fully sweet. It has a kind of hope and possibility for change and agency and protection, but always with that shadow of what we've learned in the rest of the poem that precedes this moment. So it's not that we know, we come into that moment knowing the speaker can't fully escape what is in the context and in the past experience, but we see her, trying to fashion a place of both safety and protection, sort of deliberate protection, keeping, doors that can close and swing out, no matter which way the thieves are going, right? It's sort of like there's a really strong self-protection mechanism there. So this one, it's a brief poem, really specific sensory and narrative details here. We didn't even talk about the second one, and the gold teeth, the chewing of bread and meat, the hollow body, the diction choices with burn, pointed straight. So in terms of thinking about how the poet goes about framing a self-portrait at a certain age as a kind of snapshot, it's an incredible example of a very brief but deftly done poem that uses sensory detail, narrative detail. There's this interplay of mystery and meaning that we've talked about. And then in terms of closure, there's a kind of movement towards closure, right? There's a kind of transformation or progression that happens, but it is not, it's an interplay of closure with a resistance, some resistance to that sense of closure, because we know there's this sort of lingering ominous shadow of the past hovering over the speaker and hovering over us too, as we move towards this feeling of transformation. So later, when we get to the part where we're writing, we can think about, okay, do we want to try today writing a self-portrait where we take a kind of snapshot, and what are the strategies here we might want to draw on related to all these craft moves? Ursula, hi.
Hi. I wanted to bring up one of the things that struck me really quickly, which was all the hard K sounds at the beginning and the hard T sounds that begin to move on to softer sounds as we go through the whole thing. So I was watching how it shifts over in that way as well. So
yeah, incredible sonic properties to these first lines. All the plosives here, buh, duh, duh, tuh. It's the sounds are in a way imitating or mimicking the feeling of things falling over and tumbling and being turned upside down.
And it seems to happen gradually through each stanza. You see each one getting a little bit less harsh. It seems to me like that second one, there's still a fair amount of the teeth and things like that are still there. But as we move along, it gets softer.
Yeah, a sonic transformation that resonates with the speaker's internal transformation. In that last stanza, we have the M's, made, myself, room, hum. These are much softer sounds than what we encounter in that first, those opening lines. Thank you, Ursula, for pointing that out. All right, do we have a closing thought or question about this one before we look at another one? Cass, go ahead.
I really see that last stanza as positive, and I get a sense of peace from it. That she doesn't have to fill it with stuff. She can fill it with humming, with song. And when I think of saloon doors, those are doors that do not have handles or locks on them. And I guess I get an image of she folds in. She has some resources within to keep herself safe as she swings out. Yeah, it actually reminded me of a quote from Anne Lamott, where she said, I automatically think that closing down is safe, but that really staying open and loving is safer, because then we're connected to all that life and love.
Wow, that's a great quote. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think, part of what's amazing about this very brief poem is that it can invite multiple interpretations, and a lot happens in a very short span of time and space. And, we can look to those craft devices along with, I wanted to just note that the first stanza or paragraph that Ursula pointed our attention to is fragmented, right? It just starts with this cutoff phrase, a boarded up house. But part of the way the poet is helping to convey that sense of agency as we move into that space that Cass was referring to, where the speaker is building a new kind of life, a new interior life. The sentences are full sentences with a subject and a verb, and that's really lending, helping to lend that sense of agency and change. Okay, let's look at least one other example. I was a little greedy. Like I said, I usually only include one poem for Poem Plus Prompt, but there were so many great self-portraits. Let's look at Safia El-Hilo's self-portrait with profanity. Do we have a volunteer who'd be willing to read this one out loud?
Since I've been so quiet, maybe I'll do it.
Thank you. Is it Karen?
All right. Yep.
Karen, thank you.
99 names for my God, though I know none for my. A failing not of my deity, but of my Arabic, not the language itself, rather the overeager mosaic. I hoard, I steal, I borrow from pop songs, and mine from childhood fluency I guard. My few swear words like tingling silver anklets, spare and precious, and never nearly enough to muster a proper Arabic anger, proper Arabic vulgarity, only a passing spar, always using the names of animals. I am not polite. I am only inarticulate, overproud of my little arsenal. A stranger blows a wet tobacco kiss through the window of my taxi, and I deploy my meager weapons, dog, pig, donkey, and finally my crown jewel. I pass my tongue across my teeth, crane my neck about the window and call your mother's.
Thank you, Karen. So take about a minute and just jot down some initial responses to the question of what is the poem about, or what seems to happen in it, and what is revealed about the speaker. Just jot down some notes for yourself, and then we'll hear from you. Okay, so thinking about that idea of reflecting or refracting, what would you say what would you say happens in this poem, or what is it about, and what do we learn about the speaker? Alina, go ahead. And then Mona. Alina, you'll just need to unmute yourself.
Yes. So this may be reading in more than is there, but her insufficient Arabic makes me think that this is a heritage speaker. So someone who's not who is not living in an Arabic speaking country, but knows it because she grew up speaking it with parents. So has a kind of childish and polite vocabulary that someone living in the culture would not have, and feels this impoverishment.
Yeah, so a speaker who's framing the self-portrait with language, right, which we come to, which the title tells us is not just any language, but profane language. And then the poem goes on to reveal that the profanity is actually in Arabic, that she, as the speaker says, hoards, steals, and borrows from pop songs and mines from childhood fluency. So we start to, piece together a picture of someone who's gathered some, her arsenal, as she says, of terms, but doesn't necessarily have the full set of ammunition of all the ways you could communicate in a single language. Mona, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I had my volume, I was unmuted and I didn't mean to be. Yeah, the first thing I got was frustration, because the image I'm seeing is a cab driver in a big city, like maybe New York or whatever. And this driver has not been home since childhood, and much of their language is gone. They're not around their family anymore. So the only thing they have is the profanity and possibly from the songs. And so with that frustration is the sadness of everything they're missing. They don't know what to do about it. That's what came through to me first.
Yeah, there's a sense of loss in some of the diction choices the speaker uses, like, I am only inarticulate. But what's interesting is that in the very next moment of the poem, the speaker describes herself as also over proud of her little arsenal. So there's this sense both that she recognizes how limited her vocabulary is, but also that she guards it. She guards it. So I guard my few swear words like tinkling silver anklets, spare and precious. It's sort of like, she is keeping these, they're important to her, but she knows she just has a limited supply of this vocabulary that, feels like it's part of who she is.
Like holding on to that bit of her heritage when the rest of it's gone.
Right. Yeah, this is what she's been able to, as she says, hoard, borrow, and steal, right? What she remembers and what she picks up from the materials, so to speak, around her, the environment around her. Theo, and then Alyssa, and then Connor.
Yeah, what I'm getting from this is a really interesting negotiation between like delicacy and power. And I'm thinking about the fact that it's self-portrait with profanity, but there's not actually profanity in it. So it definitely feels like there's a kind of thesis being written about womanhood and the way that women have to do this choreography of being meek, especially in certain cultures, but then also need to be able to stand their ground.
Yeah, it's certainly conveying a gendered experience of the speaker. The speaker, in my reading, the speaker is in her taxi and someone's sort of catcalling, right? This wet tobacco kiss. And that's when she deploys her what she calls her meager weapons. And in brackets, we have the words that she's saying angrily in Arabic, right? These are insults to call someone a dog, a pig, or a donkey. And the last one, she uses this elision in the first stanza, 99 names for my God, though I know none for my blank, right? We don't get that information. We don't know what it is she's referring to that she would like to be able to name in Arabic. But then in the last couplet, what we come to understand is that, my reading of it is that the insult is so bad that it has to be omitted. It's so profane. And, that's the crown jewel. I forget who I called on. I'm sorry. Alyssa and then Connor.
Yeah, kind of going off of what you and Theo were saying, like I read those last couple brackets with dog, pig, donkey, and then your mother's blank. That seems like a reclamation of her language. And I read the a failing not of my deity, but of my Arabic. To me, that seems like tongue-in-cheek or ironic, like maybe reclaiming what an American has said to her, or like a white American has said to her. Like this, she says she calls herself overproud, but this is very much like this reads to me as a poem of like pride of her culture.
Yeah, the sense of overpride coming from the fact that it's so few terms, right? There's definitely a sense of longing. The speaker wishes she had more words, in her vocabulary, in her Arabic vocabulary, but she deeply guards and values and feels proud about the ones that she has, and she's using them, right? She's firing them in a way that that is really, I think, charged and defiant and truly intentional. She's got these words and she's going to use them when the situation calls for them. She's ready with them. Connor, and then Nyla.
Yeah, I really love the use of the what I guess you call erasure, like the lack of language. I think is really clever to indicate her estrangement from her culture. But it's interesting just because I've been playing with a similar kind of self-portrait poem, but I kind of dropped it, and this kind of helps with that. Especially her talking about like I hoard, I steal, I borrow from pop songs and mine from childhood influency, that she doesn't, and it's a self-portrait, right? That she doesn't entirely know who she is beyond these things she's stolen from. And I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting that she uses the word steal, because we
Right.
get the impression
Borrow.
that it is her home language, right? Maybe her first language, because there's that childhood fluency, but not necessarily now her dominant language.
Yeah.
But there's this sense of, sort of scavenging for all the terms that she can possibly get with those swear, the swear words that she can fire as insults when needed, as being some of the, among the most precious ones, the ones that I think the poem is kind of conveying, are the ones that let her express herself in a way that's really important to her. And I think, even just thinking about swear words in English, I talked about this with my kids, where, sometimes there's some words that just let you express yourself in a way that other words don't. And some of those words are swear words, or they just don't have an equivalent in the language. And so that's sort of the feel I get from this, that these words that she's guarding, that she's learned, that are so profane, give her away in this kind of situation of expressing this, deep anger and disdain in a way that she wouldn't be able to otherwise with other languages, or with her, what might be now her dominant language, if we make that conclusion. Claudia, go ahead.
Yeah, I see. It's a great poem about language, but also about culture and religion and identity. Those first couple of lines, 99 names for my God, though I know none for my blank. It's like she's reassessing her whole relationship to God. Do I need a new word for it? Do I still feel the God of my early years and my ancestry and my culture and my upbringing? Is that still God for me? And if not, what is? And all of these new words that I'm learning, yes, they make me feel more comfortable in certain situations. They're useful. They're what I need. But maybe are they taking me away from this original God? And I just kind of felt the presence of that question kind of looming in the background of the whole poem.
That's interesting to kind of bring our attention to that. The poem does start with that notion. There are, in the Muslim tradition, 99 names for God, and she's putting that in contrast to something she doesn't have a word for in her language, something she doesn't have a word for in Arabic that she doesn't know, and she doesn't name it. But the only other sort of redacted word in in the poem I took it to be so profane, right, that it cannot be included because it's part of that final insult. So it's interesting to think about, okay, like in terms of setting that context for religion or, names for a divine entity, and then going into this, these musings about language, both what she has, the whole thing is a kind of gathering, right? We get the context of having lost language, but in the poem, the speaker is gathering. She's actively keeping and gathering this arsenal of terminology that she then employs, she utilizes when needed. So I'm curious to hear, what do people make of that setup where she starts off with this first line about the 99 names for God? Any thoughts on that, or other things in the poem that interest you or that you have questions about? Mona, and then Theo.
Yeah, I was going to say something else anyway, but since you asked that question, I don't really think she's talking about God, because I think she knows all those names for God. I think that blank represents the same blank that it does at the end. But I think what I was drawn to with listening while other people were talking is the spaces in each of the couplets, because the spaces are taking the place of punctuation. And I liked that. I've never used it in writing, but I like it. I might try it sometime.
Yeah, and in terms of thinking about the form of the poem, we've got couplets, right, throughout the entire piece. Most punctuation omitted, but the punctuation that she does use is the ampersand and then the brackets around the terms, right? The terms either that are there, the insults, dog, pig, and donkey, or the ones that are omitted, right? And then the spacing, that fragmentation, is helping to parse the syntax in a way that guides our reading as punctuation would, but is really a very, very stabilizing element in a poem that might otherwise be destabilizing, right? If there were no spaces and no punctuation, then we would have to work much harder to parse the syntax and make meaning. So that's a interesting interplay of a destabilizing move, right? Pulling out all the punctuation and creating this kind of airier and more meditative feel, and at the same time bringing in a stabilizing element to count as a counterweight, right? That white space. I think there was one person who raised their hand, but I don't see them anymore. Theo, did you have something you wanted to add? I think Theo is gone. Okay. I know we're coming up against time, so I think what we could do is, there is one more poem in here that I'll invite you to read after class, spend some time with it. The title is Self-Portrait as So Much Potential by Chen Chen. But let's take the last few minutes to just at least think for a moment about how you might frame or refract or reflect the self using something like the devices here, either a snapshot at a certain time of life, a certain phase of life, or the self-portrait with blank, whether that's an abstraction or something concrete, and maybe return to that material that you sort of brainstormed at the beginning to see if there's something you can mine. So take just 2 or 3 minutes. I'll set a timer for 2, and just start with a title and open with the first line and see where it takes you as a way of experimenting with some of these devices. But it really will only be 2 minutes. So it'll, leave you in a position with some momentum for when you get back to your desk and have some time. Okay, I know that's a super short amount of time, but I hope that you're leaving here today with a set of questions to investigate self-portraits that are in the packet or other ones that you might encounter, a little bit of draft material to dig into later when you have time, and this prompt, which I didn't actually read out loud, but on the second to last page, there's a more detailed version of the prompt that I said out loud. So, so hopefully, you know, some ideas and examples, different strategies for framing, reflecting, or refracting the self using some of the strategies that we talked about, as well as the example we didn't talk about, and a little bit of material to go on. So thank you for, you know, jumping in and reading the poems together and unpacking them. I have a class coming up with Blue Stoop along these lines on the topic of origin stories. So if you're interested in digging into autobiographical material and figuring out new ways or different ways of framing it and conveying it, I hope you'll join us for that class. You can visit my website to see the full list of classes. I have a pretty long list for this spring and into the summer. So hope to see you in a future class. Keep writing, and thanks again for being here. And thank you.
Before we exit out, I'm going to just stop